If you live in the northern hemisphere, you've probably noticed that temperatures have started to drop as we head into the fall and then ultimately into the winter. And sadly, this transitional period is when most beginner cactus collectors will kill some of their plants. It's what happened to me when I started collecting cacti, and I'm hoping that by making this video I can help some of you not have to go through that experience. So let's talk about what the colder winter months mean for cacti and succulents and how we can prepare them for their winter dormancy. If it's your first time on the channel, welcome. I hope you like cacti. We make nothing but content related to cacti and succulents in both cultivation and habitat to try to highlight the importance of their conservation. Remember, take nothing but pictures from habitat. Cacti and succulents are just like batteries. During the springtime and the summer and a part of the fall, when the days are long and hot and the sun is very intense, they use that time to photosynthesize and absorb moisture and create complex sugars, which is what they store inside of their bodies. Whenever we see our cacti sort of expand and get plump after we water them, it's not simply because they absorb moisture, but rather because they use the moisture to create complex sugars via photosynthesis, and that's what they store inside of their bodies. So whenever the days start becoming shorter and the temperatures start dropping and the sun is no longer as intense, these plants have evolved to slow down their growth considerably and stop growth altogether in lots of cases, which means in cultivation we have to make sure not to give them any added moisture, and in lots of cases any moisture whatsoever, to make sure that their roots aren't sitting in moisture for too long, since they won't be absorbing that water because they're just not doing the photosynthesis that they require in order to continue their growth cycle. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule of winter dormancy. For example, Brazilian cacti like Eubomania, disco cactus, and mellow cactus, for some reason really don't like to be dry, or they don't like their roots to be dry for very long periods of time. So specifically for those cacti, I will sprinkle a little bit of water on them during the winter time, and I'm talking about milliliters, very little quantities of water, and only in days like today where it's a little warmer than the rest of the winter, and I'll do so in the morning time. So if there is a little extra moisture that they're not absorbing in the evening, it would have evaporated by the time that they have to go to sleep and open up their stomata, which are their pores. So those cacti really don't like really extended periods of drought or complete dryness, but on this video we're going to be focusing on other cacti, especially those that have a taproot, like Mexican cacti, like Ariocarpus, Lophophora, Turbinicarpus, and others that have an extra energy storage, if you will. So they have an extra battery underneath the soil that they're able to tap into for energy if resources get extremely low. So those plants are extra sensitive to any moisture you give them during the winter time because of that taproot, which is where they store that extra energy. So they really don't need any extra water during the winter time and will actually rot at the first sign of any extra moisture during the winter, especially if your weather is extremely cold. Now, I will say that you have to take all of this advice with a grain of salt, because it's always going to depend on your weather and the interaction between your plants and your weather, and also any conditions that you have in your growing environment. Like, for example, it's not the same to live in 60-degree weather during the winter time if you have your plants inside of a greenhouse where temperatures will never go below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, or if you live in the desert where temperatures won't drop for another 2 months or 3 months. It always depends on where you have your plants and also how you're growing your plants. For example, if you have ventilation like I do, that's going to help lower that moisture level or that humidity level even further. So you may get away with watering them a little bit here and there, even at times where maybe someone else in your same environment won't be able to water them without them rotting, simply because you have that added ventilation. So with that said, just take all of my advice and any advice you see on the internet with a grain of salt, and remember, you're going to have to do trial and error and experiment a little bit before you're able to find that optimal growing environment and those conditions for your plants to thrive. So let's talk about what you can do at this point in time when temperatures still haven't reached a critical point, which is, for me, I like to keep my threshold at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. After temperatures go below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I will stop watering all of my plants. Although we do have very mild winters here in Miami, I still like to give my plants winter dormancy because I have found and I have read that it helps them with blooming the following season. And like I'm always telling people, you will never kill your cacti from drought, but you definitely can kill them by watering them at the wrong time of the year. So I would rather be extra cautious, especially with plants that are getting pretty expensive nowadays. It's always better to be extra careful since extended drought is not going to kill them. These plants have evolved to survive those situations, and although they can get pretty dramatic, some of them turn into pancakes, completely flat, and they do exactly the same in nature. They have evolved to go through those situations, and it's not going to hurt them at all. When springtime comes and you start watering them, they will bounce right back and they will turn into the same beautiful plants they were. As unbelievable as it sounds, plants, especially like, for example, the genre Lophophora, they get completely flat and they look terrible after a long dormancy. And as soon as you give them a little bit of water, they plump right back up and they look completely fine. Now, there are some exceptions, like for example, Astrophytum. Sometimes they can wrinkle to the point where there's no coming back. So if you have an Astrophytum asterias, for example, that starts to wrinkle, I do recommend you give them a little bit of water, as we said before, during the morning time, and hopefully in a day that's a little bit warmer, so that they can sort of stay looking a little bit normal and they don't have to wrinkle so much, because I know it can cause a lot of anxiety to see them sort of wrinkling up and reducing their size. But they do exactly the same thing in nature. It's a totally normal part of their life, and you will never kill them with drought, but you definitely can kill them with too much water. So always err on the side of caution. Always keep them in drought. Even if they get a little dramatic, it's totally fine. They can take it and they can survive it. And not only that, but it helps them bloom the following season because they become stronger as they experience those periods of drought, just like in nature. Now let's talk about repotting. If you have to repot a plant during fall, especially well into the fall, right before the winter time, you have to do it. There's no way around it. But you only really have to do it if, for example, you were to knock off a pot and the plant comes out of the soil, or if you receive a brand new plant that you just bought. But if you want to up-pot your plant, I really recommend you wait until the springtime, because as all cactus processes and everything related to their life, for them to start rooting takes a long time and it takes a lot of energy for them to do so. So whenever you repot a plant, it basically has to deploy hormones to the root structure that tell it, okay, we're in soil again, we can start rerooting into this new soil. And that whole process not only takes a long time, but it also requires a lot of energy from them. So if you can imagine that these plants go into dormancy when they stop their growth and they're no longer spending any energy because they're not able to create any more energy, you really don't want to give them a lot more work to do, like rerooting, before you absolutely have to. That's why it's always best to wait to repot them during the springtime or during the summer when they're actively growing. Now, as I said, if you absolutely have to repot one of them, go ahead and repot it. Don't worry, it's not gonna die. You just have to make sure that you don't let it, for example, get too much direct sunlight right away, because too much direct sunlight when they're not rooted into the soil and absorbing any moisture whatsoever means not only are they expending some of their energy, but also they're losing some moisture due to the extreme heat. And you want to sort of baby them a little bit until they're able to re-root into that new soil. So whenever you receive a brand new plant, I also recommend that you don't water it right away. I usually wait 3 weeks to up to 3 months depending on the plant. If the plant has a taproot, it generally means you have to wait longer because they have that extra energy storage and they really don't need the extra water. I also want to mention water therapy. I never recommend you do water therapy. Patience trumps all with cactus cultivation. If you want your plants to root or you want your plants to sort of start looking big and plump again, just be patient with them. They will go back to being normal again. But water therapy is like Russian roulette. It can work. I have seen it work in lots of cases, lots of different genres of cacti, but it can also kill your plant immediately. So if I were you, I would definitely not risk it and just give them a little bit of time to do their thing. These plants have their own survival mechanisms, which they've evolved over hundreds and hundreds of years. So they really don't need to be dunked inside of a container filled with water in order to reroot. Yes, that may speed up the process a little bit, but it's also inviting fungal infections to come in through the root structure and kill them off. And these plants are getting very expensive, especially the more mature specimen. So it's always better to be extra careful with them. And if it's not necessary to give them water therapy, which is also not natural for them whatsoever, these plants are never sitting in moisture, with some very, very small exceptions here and there. So it's best not to try these internet fads that really have no sort of research behind them. So if you can wait to repot in the springtime, wait to repot in the springtime. And with your regular plants, which have been potted for a while and you've been actively watering them throughout the season, now is the time to start reducing the amount of water that you're putting into their pots, and also the frequency with which you water. I have started watering them about once a month. I usually water about once every 2 weeks during the growing season, and now I started to do it once a month. And all of this is extra helpful if you're using mostly inorganic soil. If you don't know what that is, check out my website, eastcoastcamanchaca.com. I sell mostly inorganic soil, and I also have articles talking about the benefits of using mostly inorganic soil, some of which include faster drainage and better aeration of the root system, and a whole other plethora of things that are very beneficial to these plants, because in the wild, they don't live in peat moss and a lot of organic content. So in cultivation, since their growth area is reduced, especially when it comes to their root systems, you really have to be careful of what goes into those pots, because those roots are really not accustomed to, or they're really not happy in added moisture for extended periods of time. Now, if you live in an area with extremely cold winters, where for example it snows and it's just very, very cold during the winter time, many of your plants, or I would say most of your cacti, will be happier if you were to bring them indoors. If you can bring them indoors, I definitely recommend you do so if temperatures drop below 37 degrees. That's usually about the point where there's really no benefit to having them outside. If temperatures drop below 37 degrees, they're definitely going to be dormant, and they will very much appreciate a little extra warmth if you can provide it. So if you live in a place with very extreme weather during the winter time, 37 degrees, it's not a magical number, guys. You can definitely experiment and figure out your own sort of range where you should bring them inside, but 37 degrees is a very good starting point. If you don't know, it's better off to start off in sort of a metric that is more accurate than just telling you when it gets cold, because cold can mean different things to different people. I mean, I'm sure if you go to Wyoming, they will think cold is different to what I consider cold. So if temperatures drop below 37 degrees, if you can, bring your plants inside. And if you can't, definitely stop watering them, at least, because they're going to be completely dormant. They won't be absorbing that moisture, and you don't want those roots sitting in standing water, especially during winter cold weather. So if you live in an area where it's starting to get cold, I hope you found this a little helpful, and just go ahead and check out that weather forecast. And if you still have some days of a little bit of warmth left, go ahead and get those last waterings of the year in before your plants go completely dormant. And I assure you, your plants will thank you for it. And as always, if you have any questions, drop them in the comment section down below, and I'll make sure to make another video addressing some of your questions. And if you get a chance, check out my website, eastcoastcamanchaca.com, for cactus t-shirts, potting soil, or plants. Catch you on the next episode.